Deep in the Virginia State Archives, hidden far beneath mountains of administrative papers no one had touched for centuries, rests a collection of documents that officials once tried with all their might to bury. 23 fragile witness accounts, 14 coroner's reports, each describing deaths so brutal they almost defied words, and one journal, its pages still marred by old stains of blood. A journal that carried the name of a woman who in Henrico County came to embody terror itself. The year was 1801, and Kate Bender had begun what the locals would whisper about in hushed voices as the hunting season that never truly ended. What makes these records so haunting is not only the cruelty they describe, but the cold, methodical precision with which they record a reign of violence, one that claimed the lives of at least 37 escaped slaves in less than 2 years. Even more chilling is how near these atrocities came to disappearing forever, lost to silence and secrecy. Before we step deeper into the shadows surrounding Kate Bender and the nightmare she unleashed upon the forests of Henrico County, let me pause a moment. This channel exists to share the darkest, most carefully researched mysteries of history stories that others often dare not tell. If you find yourself drawn to tales like this, consider joining us here. And I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps Virginia itself, or somewhere far away, yet connected now by this story. The papers rediscovered in 1987 sent a shockwave through academic circles, but their contents were swiftly sealed again, deemed too disturbing for the public. What you are about to hear comes from those hidden pages, from surviving testimony, from the fragments of court records that together sketch a picture of evil, so relentless, so deliberate, it unsettles everything we thought we knew about the era of the Underground Railroad. Picture Richmond, Virginia in 1801. A city balanced on a knife's edge. Only months earlier, Gabriel Prosser's rebellion had failed, leaving the entire region trembling with paranoia. Plantation owners slept with muskets at their sides. Enslaved men and women vanished into the night in greater numbers than ever before. Fear hung thick in the air. It was in this atmosphere of suspicion and unrest that Kate Bender stepped forward from obscurity and into infamy. Henrico County, just beyond Richmond's crowded tobacco markets, was a place of sprawling plantations. Dirt roads wound like veins through forests, and swamps paths that became lifelines for those fleeing bondage. Secret routes of the Underground Railroad stretched across this wilderness routes that would soon become Kate's hunting ground. And who was this woman? Kate Bender was unforgettable. Nearly 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad as a soldier's and arms strong as oak, she carried the presence of someone impossible to ignore. Witnesses said her hands alone could crack walnuts with a snap, even bend iron horseshoes as if they were twigs. Yet it was her eyes, pale grey, unblinking, that left people uneasy. They did not look at you but through you, as though always measuring, always calculating. She was born Catherine Elizabeth Hartwell in 1765 to poor tenant farmers in the Virginia Piedmont. From her earliest years, she learned that survival demanded strength, and mercy was a luxury she could not afford. Her childhood was spent in the fields, shoulders aching under the labor of tobacco, her family forever shadowed by the threat of eviction. Such hardships hardened her spirit, teaching her that life was a contest of endurance and violence, often its only language. By adulthood, She was already notorious. Disputes ended at her fists. Men twice her size backed away from her stare. Few dared to cross her. In 1789, she married Thomas Bender, a plantation overseer. Thomas was not tall, barely 5 feet 8, but his cruelty was a legend across Henrico County. He wielded a whip studded with iron and invented punishments designed not only to break bodies, but to unmake souls. Most wives would recoil from such a man. Kate did not. She watched him in silence, eyes gleaming as if every lash, every broken cry was not a horror, but a lesson. The Bender plantation house rose from 200 acres of rich tobacco soil, framed by the slow waters of the Chickahominy River to the north and thick pine forests to the south. It was Thomas who oversaw the labor of nearly 40 enslaved workers, ruling them with a cruelty so relentless that it silenced even the boldest spirits. Public beatings were common families, torn apart without warning, and whispers of betrayal encouraged through a network of informants. Within the house itself, Kate reigned with no less severity. She controlled the domestic slaves with such merciless discipline that more than one tried to end their life rather than endure another day under her gaze. Neighbors, even from a distance, often heard the sounds of shattering furniture, the crash of glass, the rise of furious voices late into the night. Their marriage was a storm, violent, destructive, yet bound by a dark devotion. Thomas seemed almost in awe of his towering wife, as if he had found in her the one soul who shared his appetite for suffering. And Kate, for her part, looked upon him as the only man capable of standing beside her in the shadows. They never had children. Locals gossiped endlessly, claiming Kate's unnatural size or her cold temperament had cursed her womb. A physician, Dr. Samuel Richardson, who occasionally tended to the plantation, wrote in his private notes words that now seem almost prophetic. He described Kate as possessing the constitution of a draft animal, her body too strong, too unyielding, and her behavior suggesting, in his view, a disconnection from human feeling itself. By the turn of the century, the Bender name had become a whispered warning among the enslaved community. Workers told one another of comrades beaten to death for minor missteps, of Kate's unsettling joy as she watched punishments carried out of the strange pleasure both she and Thomas seemed to draw from breaking apart families. Some tried to flee, but Thomas's skill as a tracker and Kate's intimate knowledge of the wilderness made escape almost impossible. It was in these tense months that rumors began to ripple across Virginia. Gabriel Prosser's planned rebellion was gathering momentum, and Thomas, seasoned and ruthless, was asked to help organize the defense. With enthusiasm, he drilled patrols, interrogated suspects, and mapped strategies to smother rebellion before it could spark. Kate, watching from the sidelines, grew restless. She soon began joining him on night patrols. Imagine her massive frame moving silently through the woods, keeping pace with men half her size eyes scanning the shadows. Those who marched beside her would later say it seemed to awaken something in her, a hunger, a predatory instinct that words could barely capture. The rebellion itself, as history records, never truly began. Betrayed by informants, scattered by storm, Gabriel and his companions were captured and executed, their severed heads left on pikes, grim warnings to any who might dream of freedom. But the storm they had tried to summon did not fade. It left in its wake an air thick with suspicion. Plantation owners saw insurrection in every whispered conversation, and their reprisals grew harsher by the day. It was within this climate of fear that Thomas made a decision, one that would set in motion everything to follow. On the morning of October 15th, 1800, the skies hung low and grey. A bitter wind carrying the scent of dying leaves across Henrico County. Word had reached Thomas. A group of fugitives was moving north along the river. 5 men, 2 women fleeing plantations further south, chasing the faint hope of freedom. Thomas gathered his hunting party. At his side stood 2 overseers, Samuel Clark and William Patterson, along with 4 hounds bred for the pursuit of human beings. Kate, of course, demanded to go. She argued that her knowledge of the terrain would prove invaluable. Thomas hesitated. After all, hunting fugitives was considered a man's duty. But Kate's persistence wore him down. She took up a heavy oak club, its weight fitting her hand like a promise, and joined the party with an eagerness that perhaps should have chilled the men around her. The hunting party left before dawn, their breath misting in the chill as the dogs caught the faint scent along the riverbank. Through the thickets, Kate moved with startling ease for a woman of her size. Her pale eyes swept the ground, always searching, always calculating. Where others saw only brush and shadow, she saw clues, broken branches, faint tracks pressed into the damp earth. She seemed exhilarated, calling back in a low voice whenever she found fresh signs. By midday, the dogs grew restless, baying with excitement as the trail grew sharper, stronger. Thomas judged they were no more than an hour behind. The men pressed harder, and Kate seemed to come alive. Her breath quickened. Her movements took on the air of something less than human, something closer to the predator she was becoming. At last, they found them. 7 fugitives huddled in a clearing beside a creek, exhausted, unaware of how close danger had crept. Their ages spanned generations, from a teenage boy, his face still soft with youth, to a grey-haired woman who could barely keep pace. They shared what little food remained, believing perhaps they had survived another night. But then, the hunters stepped from the trees. What followed was told many times in many voices, though never with the same detail. Samuel Clark later swore under oath that Thomas demanded surrender, that the eldest among them, Joshua, a preacher on his plantation, tried to reason with him. He offered his life for the freedom of the others, a plea for mercy. Thomas answered with the crack of his whip across Joshua's face, opening flesh, drawing blood that stained the forest floor. It was the spark that ignited chaos. The younger men leapt forward to defend their elder. The women and the boy fled into the trees. Shouts rose, dogs snarled, and in the confusion, Thomas gave chase after 2 of the younger men toward the creek. That was the last time the others saw him alive. 2 hours later, his body was found floating face down in the shallow water, skull shattered. Official records claim a rock had struck him, but Kate's private journal, later discovered among her belongings, whispers a different story. In her jagged, uneven script, she wrote that she had seen everything, that Thomas had cornered the fugitives, beating them mercilessly when desperation gave them strength. They struck back, seizing stones from the creek, bludgeoning him until he fell. She claimed she stood frozen, watching, unable to move, unable to stop it. But was she truly just a witness? Or had her own hand guided the end? That question has lingered in shadows for centuries, and investigators who later studied the case could never agree. What is known is this. When the others arrived, Thomas lay lifeless in the creek, and Kate was on her knees beside him. Witnesses swore her enormous frame shook as though with grief. But some said it was not grief they saw. Something colder, something stranger. The two men who had supposedly struck the fatal blows were never captured. They vanished into the wilderness, leaving only bloodied stones and the body of one of Henrico County's most feared overseers. Samuel Clark and William Patterson helped Kate carry him back in silence. No words could pass their lips. The funeral drew nearly every plantation owner in the county. His death was not mourned as a man but as a symbol. A white overseer killed by slaves and no justice delivered. To them, it was a dangerous wound in the order that ruled their world. Voices rose demanding harsher patrols, harsher punishments. Fear and fury hung thick in the air. And yet, through it all, Kate sat stone-faced, silent, her eyes giving nothing away. No one there could have guessed what was stirring behind that mask, what transformation was already beginning to take shape within her. The death of Thomas Bender did not shatter Kate with grief as so many expected. It stirred something far darker, something ancient, primal, and long asleep within her. As the coffin was lowered into the red earth, she did not weep. She did not cling to the edges of mourning like a grieving widow. Instead, she was already shaping in her mind the vengeance that would consume the rest of her life. Dr. Richardson, who attended in his role as family physician, would later confess that her presence at the graveside left him deeply unsettled. She spoke to no one. She offered no tears. She only stared at the gathering of mourners with the same cold, calculating expression she had once worn while watching Thomas whip the enslaved. When neighbors pressed forward with murmured condolences, her replies were clipped monosyllabic, so flat, so emptied of tone, that more than one person left the conversation chilled to the bone. In the weeks that followed, Kate withdrew almost completely from society. She dismissed most of the plantation's workers, keeping only a handful to sustain the barest operations. More and more, she was seen wandering alone through the forests that bordered her land. Neighbors who chanced upon her described her eyes scanning the trees, the streams, the animal trails, memorizing every inch of wilderness, as though the land itself were becoming her companion. By December of 1800, she had slipped fully from the rhythms of normal life. The Bender plantation, once echoing with cruel commands, and the crack of the overseer's whip fell into silence. The house, dark and brooding, seemed a place others instinctively avoided. In town, merchants noted her strange purchases rope in great lengths, iron snares meant for trapping beasts. Heavy tools whose purpose she never explained. What no one yet realized was that Kate, cloaked in the guise of widowhood, was preparing herself. Her grief was a mask. Beneath it, she was perfecting the skills and strategies that would soon make her the most feared predator in all of Henrico County. But transformations such as hers do not happen in a single night. Through the long, bitter winter of 1800 and into the hesitant thaw of early spring, she remade herself, slowly, methodically. And when she finally emerged, she was no longer simply the widow of a brutal overseer. She had become something far more terrifying. The first known victim appeared on March 23, 1801. His name was Samuel, a young man who had fled a plantation nearly 40 miles to the south, tracing the Chickahominy River north in search of freedom. For days he had evaded pursuit. But he did not escape Kate. A week later, his body was discovered hanging from the broad limbs of an oak tree just 2 miles from her land. A hemp rope tightened around his neck. But the details told a darker tale. His hands had been bound behind his back with thick leather straps. His clothes were torn, marked by a desperate struggle through thickets and underbrush. And the bruises on his neck revealed something more chilling still. He had been strangled by hand before being hanged, as if his killer wanted not only death, but death twice over. Constable James Whitfield carried out a perfunctory investigation, eager to close the matter. His report declared Samuel's death a suicide born of despair at his failed escape. But those who had seen the body knew better. Nothing about the scene spoke of surrender. It spoke, instead, of pursuit, of capture, of deliberate cruelty. And yet, to acknowledge that would mean admitting that a white hand had killed him. And so, the truth was left buried as the body swung silently in the forest wind. The case of Samuel's death was neatly closed within 2 weeks. His body was lowered into an unmarked grave in the county's Potter's Field, his name erased before it could ever be spoken aloud. Yet, for those who knew how to read the signs, his death was not an ending. It was the first stroke in a pattern that would become impossible to ignore. During the long, cold winter months, Kate had not been idle. She studied the ways of the hunted with a patience that bordered on obsession. She traced the routes that runaways gathered for food, watched the paths they favored, and catalogued their habits with the same ruthless precision her husband had once used to break the spirits of the enslaved. She had discovered something vital, that fugitives almost always followed the water. Rivers and streams provided not only drinking water, but protection for dogs lost the trail at the river's edge. The Chickahominy River and its twisting tributaries formed a hidden highway through Henrico's forests. Kate walked its every curve, every bend of sandbar, every thicket where a weary soul might stop to rest. She learned the smallest signs: a twig snapped at the wrong height, a scatter of leaf, litter, the faintest thread of fabric snagged on thorns. And perhaps most chilling of all, she had begun to study not only the land, but the hearts of the desperate, their need for shelter, their tendency to cling to hope even as fear hollowed them out. It was in early April, when a violent thunderstorm split the skies, that Kate's second victim revealed herself. Her name was Rebecca. She had been traveling with companions but became lost in the storm, driven into isolation by the flood of rain and panic. Alone, exhausted, and unfamiliar with the terrain, she stumbled across what seemed a sanctuary, an abandoned tobacco barn. She curled into its shadows, clutching her belongings, and closed her eyes in fragile relief. But Kate had been watching that barn for weeks. She found Rebecca just before dawn, and it was here that Kate unveiled what would become her signature cruelty. She did not kill her quickly. No, she bound her tightly and spent hours whispering every horror she intended to enact. Kate later wrote in her journal of the beauty she found in Rebecca's fear, how it blossomed slowly, how she savored the moment when hope drained from her victim's eyes and left only despair. To Kate, it was not murder. It was balance. It was justice for her husband's death, twisted and reimagined in her mind. 3 days later, a farmer searching for stray cattle stumbled upon Rebecca's body. She had been strangled with her own clothing and propped against a tree as though seated waiting. The staging was deliberate, an unmistakable message to those who might think of fleeing. This time, Constable Whitfield could not claim it was suicide. The signs of foul play were too evident, too brazen. And yet, even now, the thought that a white hand might be behind these deaths was too great for local authorities to face. So Whitfield reshaped the story. He spoke of rivalries among fugitives, of punishments dealt by their own, a fiction that soothed the fears of his neighbors while neatly sidestepping the truth. Officially, the case remained open. In practice, it was left to rot. Meanwhile, Kate was already hunting again. Rebecca's death had been a lesson, a rehearsal that taught her the value of isolation, of staging, of savoring every moment of control. She had discovered in herself a depth of cruelty greater than even Thomas's, and she found that knowledge intoxicating. By late spring, her hunger had grown. Her third victim was Marcus, a teenage boy who had fled a plantation in neighboring Chesterfield County. For 3 days, Kate tracked him through the wilderness patient as a shadow. She studied the rhythm of his movements, the places he stopped to rest, the way desperation drove him. At last, she cornered him by a creek where he bent to drink, but Marcus did not surrender. Young, strong, and fierce, he fought with the desperation of one who has nothing to lose. The struggle was brutal. For nearly 20 minutes, they battled Kate, emerging bloodied and bruised from his blows. And yet, her sheer size and strength overwhelmed him. She strangled him with her bare hands, pressing down until his body went limp beneath her. In her journal, she wrote of that moment with startling intimacy. The satisfaction was different, more physical, more primal, almost ecstatic. Marcus had proven her power, confirmed that even the strongest opponent could not break her. And in that moment, she felt herself crowned with a terrible sense of dominion. When Marcus's body was discovered days later, it swung from a tree branch 20 feet above the ground. A feat of strength so immense, it stunned all who saw it. And though the community whispered in unease, few dared to ask the most dangerous question of all who had the power and the will to place him there. The message could no longer be mistaken. To anyone who had followed the grim trail of bodies, it was clear a powerful and methodical killer was moving through Henrico County. 3 lives stolen in just 2 months, all within the same narrow span of forest and river, all bearing the marks of overwhelming strength. Even the most willfully blind officials could not pretend it was coincidence anymore. Constable Whitfield, pressed by nervous plantation owners who feared what whispers might grow from these murders, at last admitted the unthinkable. A serial killer walked among them, but to acknowledge the predator was one thing. To stop her was something else entirely. Kate had grown into her role with terrifying skill. She knew the forest as though it were a second skin. She could move through thickets without breaking a twig, vanish into shadow as if the trees themselves were shielding her. And her uncanny sense of where the desperate would run when they would rest made her appear less like a human hunter and more like something supernatural. In public, however, Kate was flawless, a grieving widow tending her late husband's estate. She sat quietly in the third pew each Sunday, bowed her head at hymns, murmured just enough to her neighbors to appear present. No one looked twice. no one suspected that the woman whispering prayers was the same who stalked the woods by lantern-light eyes fixed on human prey. She had mastered the art of dividing herself. Public face calm and ordinary, private self monstrous and relentless. And what was most chilling was not only the killings themselves, but the story she told herself about them. In Kate's mind, she was not murdering. She was restoring order, rebalancing the scales for her husband's death. Every life she ended was to her righteous. She believed she was acting in service of justice, twisted though it was. And this conviction removed the natural barriers that stop most killers: the doubts, the guilt, the shame. For Kate, there was only purpose. By the summer of 1801, she was no longer simply a murderer. She had become a predator, one who had found both her hunting ground and her prey. The forests of Henrico County had become her kingdom, and anyone who tried to slip through them unseen was stepping into her domain. Kate's methods were refined with each kill. She divided the land into territories, rotating through them like a soldier following a campaign map. Every creek, every ravine, every hollow, where a fugitive might pause, she had marked them, studied them. She constructed hidden observation posts stocked with supplies so she could lie in wait for days without detection. From these shadows, she watched, patient learning the rhythms of those who passed by. She could tell from a broken twig not just that someone had been there, but when, in which direction they traveled, even whether they limped from exhaustion or carried a heavy burden. Her understanding of the psychology of flight was equally precise. She knew fugitives traveled by night, clung to rivers, and sought thickets for cover. She knew fear made them predictable, that exhaustion bent their choices toward the obvious. She knew families would cling to one another, that groups would scatter under pressure and attempt to reunite. And she knew that the lonely ones, the travelers abandoned or lost, would gamble recklessly for survival. She took all of it into her calculations, weaving their own instincts into traps against them. Her fourth victim, or rather her fourth set of victims, proved how far she had come. Isaiah, a man who had fled from a plantation in Goochland County, traveled with his pregnant wife Sarah and their 8-year-old son David. By the time Kate first sighted them, resting by a stream just 3 miles from her land, they were already fraying at the edges. Sarah's pregnancy slowed them, David was sickly and weak, and Isaiah's desperation was growing sharper with each passing day. Kate did not strike at once. Instead, she watched them for 2 long days, studying, waiting. She saw Isaiah's frustration, Sarah's exhaustion, the way their small shelter barely held against the chill of night. And then she began her quiet torment. She stole their blankets. She fouled their water. She left behind subtle signs of pursuers, just enough to unnerve them, to drive them from safer hiding places into exposed ground. She did not need to attack directly. Fear was her first weapon, hunger her second. She broke them down from a distance until they were weakened, frantic, and ripe for the moment she chose to appear. The pressure Kate applied to the family was not through open violence at first, but through something far more insidious. The constant, calculated psychological strain wore them down in ways no weapon could. Isaiah grew paranoid, restless and reckless, his judgment faltering with each passing day. Sarah's health declined steadily, her body weakened by pregnancy and stress. David the child began showing signs of malnutrition. By the time Kate finally revealed herself, the family was too exhausted, too beaten in spirit to resist. Her journals from this time remain some of the most disturbing documents to survive from the early 19th century. She wrote about the family's collapse with an almost clinical fascination, comparing their fading hope to the breaking of a difficult horse or the taming of a stubborn dog. To her, their pain was not cruelty, but inevitability proof that those who defied the order of things were destined to be crushed beneath it. The killings stretched across 3 days. Kate began with David strangling the child before his parents' eyes, then wielded his death as a tool to torment them further. She taunted Isaiah and Sarah with promises of what would come next, savoring their despair. She seemed to draw particular pleasure from Sarah's desperate pleas for her unborn child, writing of it as evidence of the weakness that made enslaved people unfit for freedom. Isaiah's end came on the 2nd day. Kate forced him to dig graves for his wife and child, then strangled him with the same rope she had used on David. She left his body in the open, calling it a monument to the futility of rebellion. Sarah survived only a few hours beyond that, her body failing under the weight of trauma, dehydration, and despair. When the bodies were discovered, Henry County could no longer dismiss the murders as rumor. 3 more runaways were dead: a pregnant woman, a child, and a father, and the brutality could no longer be ignored. The plantation class, alarmed not for the victims, but for the order their deaths threatened, began to pressure authorities into action. Among the enslaved, whispers spread of a white demon haunting the woods between Virginia and freedom. Constable Whitfield, sensing his career might depend on it, at last announced a proper investigation. He assembled search parties, took statements, and even offered a small reward. But Kate had chosen her hunting grounds well. The forests she knew intimately were vast and nearly impossible for others to navigate. Searchers might spend weeks and find nothing, while she, hidden and watchful, moved freely among them. Even more decisive was the blind spot of social prejudice. No one imagined that such killings could be the work of a woman. From the start, investigators assumed their quarry must be male. Kate operated under a shield of invisibility, unnoticed, underestimated, and therefore untouchable. Her journals from this period show her awareness of this advantage, and a growing belief that her work was not temporary vengeance, but her life's true calling. By the late summer of 1801, her pace quickened. She killed a blacksmith named Abraham who had fled Richmond, twin brothers Matthew and Mark who escaped from a Charles City plantation, and an elderly woman named Ruth who had hoped to reach Pennsylvania and sanctuary among free blacks. Each murder showed refinements in Kate's technique, longer periods of psychological torture, more elaborate manipulations of hope before extinguishing it. She also began keeping trophies: a scrap of clothing, a trinket, sometimes even something more grotesque. She built a cellar beneath her home where she arranged and rearranged these tokens, reliving each killing in private. The journals describing these rituals read like the writings of someone who had crossed beyond the limits of ordinary human cruelty into something colder, darker, unrecognizable. By October of 1801, at least a dozen lives had ended at her hands. Along the routes of the Underground Railroad, rumors of the forest demon spread. Conductors warned fugitives to avoid Henry County altogether, and new paths were carved through unfamiliar terrain to bypass the danger. But to Kate, This was no deterrent. It was an invitation. She expanded her hunting range, tracking escapees farther from home, refining her methods once again. The hunting season that had begun with her husband's death showed no signs of ending. Kate Bender was only just beginning to uncover the full scope of her cruelty. As autumn sank into winter, her reputation outgrew the borders of Henrio County. Stories spread like infection through Virginia's Underground Railroad, whispered from one conductor to another tales of the White Demon who stalked the forests between Richmond and Freedom. What should have been a path of deliverance had become, under her shadow, a corridor of dread. The terror she sowed reached far beyond the graves she filled. For each person she murdered, dozens more abandoned escape attempts or diverted to routes so long and dangerous they carried their own risks of death. The fragile lifeline of freedom that had begun to take root in central Virginia was paralyzed. And Kate understood this perfectly. She nourished the legend, shaping it with grisly theatricality. By now she had begun arranging her victims as though they were messages carved into the forest. Corpses positioned to shock and scar the witnesses who stumbled upon them. Her 13th victim, a young woman named Charity, escaped from a plantation near Petersburg, was found suspended upside down from a massive oak. Her throat had been cut nearly to the spine, her head hanging by little more than sinew. The sheer strength required to stage her body was undeniable, but the cruelty behind it was colder still. Kate wanted all who saw the scene to understand. This was not the work of ordinary human hands. The story spread like fire among the enslaved, magnified with each retelling. Some said the demon could track by scent. Others that she glided noiselessly between the trees, or that she fed on fear itself before striking the final blow. Kate's own writings from the period show her satisfaction with these tales. She was no longer avenging her husband. She was becoming myth, a force of nature punishment, incarnate for those who dared seek freedom. Winter brought new challenges, which she approached with her usual precision. Snow made her prey easier to track, but made her movements more conspicuous. She devised shoes that spread her weight, disguising her steps as the tracks of animals. The cold itself became her accomplice. Fugitives were forced to linger in shelters, leaving smoke-trampled snow and debris that betrayed their presence. Her 14th victim was Ezekiel, a middle-aged man from Hanover County. He had seized his chance on Christmas Day when the plantation's vigilance was dulled by celebration. Seeking refuge, he chose an abandoned tobacco barn. It was a fatal mistake. Kate had watched the building for weeks, knowing its isolation would draw the desperate. She arrived before dawn. Rather than storming inside, she barred the doors, trapping him. Then the torment began. For hours, she scraped at the walls, made guttural, inhuman sounds, and allowed glimpses of her hulking shadow through the cracks. She vanished for long stretches, letting hope rekindle, then returned with fresh horrors. 8 hours passed in this fashion. By the end, Ezekiel was no longer a man, but a husk, babbling incoherently broken, long before the rope touched his neck. Her journal described this as education, not cruelty. Each moment of fear was to her a lesson proof to others of the futility of rebellion. When she finally entered, Ezekiel offered no resistance. She strangled him swiftly, then arranged his body, as she had so many others, suspended from the barn's central beam, the noose made from his own clothing. A farmer found him 3 days later while searching for lost cattle. The discovery changed everything. This was no longer a story that could be dismissed as rumor or contained within the enslaved community. Constable Whitfield, pressed by both planters and state authorities in Richmond, could not ignore the implications. A killer unchecked was dismantling the order of things, and if slaves could be hunted without consequence, then law itself was faltering. Governor James Monroe intervened. Reports from Henrico County convinced him to act. He authorized state militia to aid in the hunt. 20 men under Captain Robert Hayes rode into the forests, their orders clear to scour the land, to flush out the demon who had turned Virginia's shadowed woods into a theater of horror. The militia who arrived in Henrico County were no ordinary patrol. These were seasoned woodsmen, men hardened by frontier wars and years of tracking through hostile forests. Their eyes were trained to follow the faintest sign, a snapped twig, a bent blade of grass. Yet, Kate Bender, watching from the shadows, did not tremble at their presence. She observed them with something closer to amusement. Her journal from this period drips with contempt. She wrote of their clumsy searchlines, their heavy boots, their unfamiliarity with the land. For over a year, she had studied every ravine and streambed, every hollow tree and hidden trail. The militia, pressured by Richmond to deliver results, were hunting a ghost in terrain that belonged to her alone. And perhaps most astonishingly, they were not even hunting her. They sought a man, not a widow cloaked in mourning black. The woods were vast, dense, almost primeval. Even the most skilled trackers among the militia struggled to navigate them. Kate knew where they faltered. She learned their routines, their blind spots, and with cold calculation, she turned their very presence into a weapon. Escaped slaves, frightened of encountering soldiers, strayed from known routes and stumbled into the labyrinth she controlled. Her hunting ground grew richer with each passing day. It was during this period that she claimed her 15th victim, a girl named Patience. Barely more than a child, she had been separated from a group of runaways while fleeing a patrol. Lost, terrified, and unfamiliar with the wilderness, she stumbled into a cave Kate had watched for months, knowing the desperate would mistake its shelter for safety. What followed revealed how far Kate's cruelty had evolved. She did not kill Patience at once. She bound her, kept her alive, and used her cries as bait. Over nearly a week, her suffering drew 2 more fugitives into the trap, both of whom met the same fate. When the militia finally found the cave, the 3 bodies were staged together in a grotesque display, twisted as if they had died defending one another. But the marks of prolonged torture told another story. Captain Robert Hayes, hardened by years of violence, admitted in his report to Governor Monroe that the scene defied comprehension. He wrote of depravity so profound as to challenge belief in the killer's humanity. 6 weeks the militia searched. 6 weeks they combed forest and swamp. And after 6 weeks, they admitted defeat. Hayes confessed privately that they had been outmatched chasing something that seemed always a step ahead, a predator whose mastery of the land rivaled their own. He recommended local civilian trackers. But the truth was simpler. They had hunted a phantom, and the phantom had won. For Kate, their withdrawal was triumph. She had not merely survived the net thrown around her, she had fed upon it, claimed new victims under its very shadow. The failure of the militia hardened her self-image. No longer was she simply a widow, bent on vengeance. She was becoming something greater, something elemental. In her mind, she was invincible. Spring came, and with it a fresh wave of escape attempts. Warmer nights coaxed the desperate into motion. The brief presence of soldiers had lulled some into believing the demon had been captured or driven off. Kate knew better. She waited. And when they came, she struck. By now, the stories about her had grown into folklore. Tales so extravagant that they barely resembled truth yet served her perfectly. Some whispered she could shapeshift. Others claimed she appeared in 2 places at once. Still others said she devoured not flesh but souls. And Kate, ever the manipulator, fed these tales with her staging. She began leaving bodies in ritualistic patterns, scattering strange symbols and objects meaningless in themselves but pregnant with terror to those desperate for explanation. Her 16th victim, Daniel the blacksmith, bore the most chilling mark of this new phase. He was found crucified against a massive oak railroad spikes driven through his hands and feet. The tableau was impossible to mistake. It had taken planning tools and hours of careful preparation. It was not the kill of an opportunist. It was the work of an artist of death. To Kate, this was no longer mere vengeance. It was theology. Her journals revealed the warped framework she was constructing, a belief that slavery itself was God's ordained order, that whites were divinely chosen to rule, and that the enslaved who dared to flee were not just lawbreakers but heretics, rebels against heaven. By torturing them, by killing them in ways laced with religious symbolism, she believed she was more than a predator. She was an instrument of divine justice. This conviction transformed her cruelty into purpose. She was no longer satisfied with blood alone. Each act had to mean something. Each tableau had to preach her gospel of terror. And with that twisted sense of righteousness, Kate Bender became even more dangerous. The killings were no longer simple acts of violence. In Kate's mind, they had become rituals, solemn offerings meant to restore what she believed was a sacred balance disturbed by rebellion. Each life taken was not just a death, but a sacrifice. Her 17th victim, a woman named Miriam, fled with her 2 daughters. Their tragedy unfolded as something closer to a religious play than a murder. For nearly 2 weeks, Kate shadowed them in the swamp, watching in silence, studying their patterns, their trust, their fear. She did not strike at once. Instead, she began her assault on the mind. Small slips of paper bearing Old Testament verses appeared where Miriam would find them. Passages about punishment, rebellion, divine wrath. Symbols carved into trees, ashes left in their path. It was enough. Exhausted from flight and starved of hope, Miriam began to believe the messages were not threats, but judgments that God Himself had cursed her escape. Fear of the earthly pursuer gave way to terror of eternal damnation. Kate wrote about it in her journal with the precision of a scholar dissecting faith. She understood her victim's Christianity not as strength but as weakness to be turned inward until Miriam herself dissolved into despair. By the time the killings came, they were staged as holy judgment. The mother and children arranged as though struck down by God's own hand. Pages of scripture charred around them. Icons twisted into a theater of damnation. The discovery shook the community. Slaves whispered of demons and divine curses. To run was no longer only dangerous, it was a sin, one that drew God's punishment. Even conductors on the Underground Railroad found themselves powerless, unable to promise safety when the killer seemed to carry the weight of heaven's sanction. Routes collapsed. Escapes slowed to a trickle. Her next victim, a boy named Joseph, showed how far Kate's craft had evolved. For weeks, she stalked him, haunting his steps until he no longer trusted his own senses. Shadows in the woods, strange sounds at night, the occasional flash of a symbol left in his path. By the end, Joseph believed he was being hunted by demons. When Kate finally revealed herself, the boy wept with relief to see a human face. He even thanked her for ending the torment. Before she told him the truth, she was the demon, the executioner, the hand of God against his rebellion. His body was left in a cruciform pose, draped with layers of Christian symbols, so interwoven that ministers across Virginia debated their origin. Baptist, Methodist, Catholic Kate borrowed from all, blending them into rituals of her own invention. It was theology, as weaponry scripture wielded like a blade. Reverend Samuel Crawford of the Henrico Methodist Church remembered the unease. He preached against vigilante bloodshed, but admitted privately that many in his congregation whispered approval. The unsettling detail, however, was how the killer's use of scripture betrayed a trained hand, not folk superstition. Someone with education, someone who understood the Bible intimately. Yet no one suspected Kate, the grieving widow who sat silent in the pews, her face drawn, her faith seemingly shaken. That duality was her greatest weapon. To the town, she was broken but harmless. In her journals, she revealed no contradiction, no shame, no hesitation. By 1802, she had reshaped Henrico County itself. The Underground Railroad faltered, escapees dwindled. Fear swelled until it became myth. She had perfected her role as predator so perfect that law itself seemed powerless. But perfection has its flaw. It breeds attention. And by that summer, word of the killings had spread far beyond Virginia. In Philadelphia, a free man named Augustus Freeman listened with alarm. He had escaped these fields 15 years before, carved out a life in freedom, and now watched the path behind him collapsing under Kate's reign of terror. He knew the stakes. If this woman's campaign continued, the very artery of escape through Virginia, the lifeline of countless souls would wither. 30 murders were confirmed. Whispers suggested the toll was far higher. And so, Freeman gathered allies, men and women, bound by conviction, determined to travel south and confront the predator who had cloaked herself in the mantle of divine vengeance. And that is where the tide would begin to turn. The shadow of Kate's killings now stretched far beyond Virginia. Word carried southward into the Carolinas, into Georgia, where whispers of a cursed path discouraged escape before it had even begun. Fear was not contained by borders, it traveled with stories. In Philadelphia, Augustus Freeman listened carefully. Once a slave himself, now a respected businessman and abolitionist, he understood the scale of what was happening. Even Harriet Tubman, whose daring rescues had carried countless men and women through danger, recognized that the work of the Underground Railroad in Virginia was failing. Escape routes were drying up. The balance had tipped. Someone had to intervene. Freeman devised a plan not through brute force, but through strategy. He gathered 8 men trackers, conductors, veterans of escape and survival. Men who could read sign where white patrols saw nothing, Men who could move through plantation quarters without stirring suspicion. Men who knew fear but were not ruled by it. In September of 1802, they entered Henrico County under cover of harvest work. To the white landowners, they were seasonal labor. To the enslaved community, they were something else entirely, hunters of the demon who had walked unchecked for nearly 2 years. Their investigation began not with confrontation but with patience. They traced the killings, marking each site until a pattern emerged, an invisible circle radiating outward from the abandoned Bender plantation. A place avoided by locals. A place that Freeman suspected was not abandoned at all. His suspicions proved right. From careful concealment, he watched smoke curl faintly from hidden fires, saw tracks pressed into overgrown paths. And then one night, he saw her. Kate Bender, no longer the widow in black, but a predator in motion. Rope coiled at her side. Iron tools glinting in the moonlight. She moved with a purpose that betrayed long practice. Freeman admitted later that the revelation left him shaken. He had expected a man, perhaps a ruthless slave catcher, perhaps a zealot, but not her. Not a plantation widow whose face was still known in the pews of Sunday service. It forced the team to reconsider everything. Still, observation brought insight. Freeman watched her habits, her hunts. He saw her strengths, patience, precision, silence, and her flaws. She was predictable, overconfident, certain of her dominion, and most of all, she never imagined that she could become prey. So Freeman devised a counter-hunt. They would give her what she craved, a solitary escapee, moving north through familiar trails. But this quarry would not be helpless. He would be bait. A young man named Samuel, ironically sharing the name of one of Kate's first victims, volunteered. He was skilled, disciplined, and willing to risk his life. On September 23rd, he set out 10 miles south of the Benderland, moving along one of Kate's favored corridors. His sign was deliberate broken branches, pressed footprints, the little mistakes that drew her like a moth to flame. 2 days later, she found him. Her journal, discovered much later, revealed her excitement. She believed she had stumbled upon the perfect sacrifice, a healthy young man, alone, moving predictably toward imagined freedom. For nearly a week, she followed Samuel through the forests, savoring the pursuit. She believed she was closing in on her 19th victim. What she could not see was that every step brought her deeper into Freeman's design. Hidden in the trees, his team moved with equal patience, watching both hunter and hunted. Kate prepared her rituals, envisioning a spectacle that would eclipse all she had done before. Her arrogance swelled into megalomania, convinced that God's judgment would be written in Samuel's death. She was certain the trap was hers, but in truth, Kate Bender was walking into the first trap ever set for her. For nearly 2 years, she had stalked the woods of Virginia, as if she were untouchable. But now the hunter was about to discover what it meant to be hunted herself. The confrontation came beside a small clearing near Mill Creek, 5 miles southeast of the abandoned Bender plantation. Freeman had chosen the site carefully. Thick undergrowth offered his men concealment, yet the open center of the clearing would deny Kate her usual cover. Multiple escape routes existed for Freeman's team, but not for her. It was a trap drawn with patience, precision, and quiet inevitability. Just before dawn on September 29th, Kate approached. She moved with the same predatory silence that had carried her to so many kills before her body, low, her steps certain. In the center of the clearing, Samuel lay beside a small fire, feigning the carelessness of a weary fugitive who believed himself safe at last. To Kate's eye, he was perfect, just another lamb wandering to slaughter. What she did not know was that 7 rifles were leveled at her from the shadows, each held by men who had prepared their hearts for this moment. Freeman himself crouched nearby, watching. His role was not to fire, but to command, to read Kate as one might read a battlefield. When the strike came, it was sudden. Kate erupted from the tree line, moving with terrifying speed, her massive hands darting for Samuel's throat. Dozens had died that way, but Samuel was no ordinary quarry. He twisted free and shouted the signal. The forest cracked with thunder. 7 rifles fired almost as one, their volleys slamming into her with devastating force. Bullets tore through chest, arm, thigh. Her body crashed to the earth. Any other human would have been ended instantly. But Kate Bender was not ordinary. To the men watching it, seemed impossible. She rose staggering but alive, blood flowing freely, eyes still burning with rage. In that moment, even seasoned fighters felt a tremor of doubt. Had the stories been true? Had they really lured a demon into their trap? Freeman had prepared for this. Calmly he stepped from cover pistol drawn and closed to within 10 feet. His men held their breath. Kate coughed, blood lips flecked with foam, yet her first words were not pleas for mercy. They were curses, prophecies of divine vengeance. She claimed to be God's chosen, the scourge of rebellion, and swore that her death would only feed the fire of her holy work. Freeman did not argue. His voice remained even almost clinical. He introduced himself as a conductor of the Underground Railroad. He told her plainly her reign was finished. Then, with the patience of an interrogator, he began asking questions, and she answered, not with repentance, but with arrogance. She boasted of victims never reported, of hunts that had passed unnoticed. She described her methods, her theology of cruelty, her belief that she had acted as the hand of divine justice. There was no remorse, only disappointment that she could not kill more. For half an hour, the grim exchange continued. Her wounds drained her strength, yet her mind remained sharp until the end. Her final words were not a prayer, but directions, precise instructions to the cellar beneath her plantation. There she told them they would find her trophies, keepsakes from every kill, proof of her work. She wanted it remembered. She wanted it admired. And with that, Kate Bender's voice fell silent forever. That day, Freeman's men searched the house. What they uncovered confirmed every word. Beneath the floorboards lay a hidden chamber, filled with relics of horror tokens, of lives she had taken, evidence of cruelty on a scale that defied comprehension. The hunter who had once seemed unstoppable had finally been stopped. Yet even in death, the shadow of her reign lingered in those woods, in the stories whispered for generations to come. The hidden cellar beneath the Bender plantation revealed its dreadful secrets at last. Inside lay a collection of personal belongings, torn fragments of clothing, and even preserved remains tokens from at least 43 victims. It was nearly double the number that had ever been whispered of in frightened circles. Each piece had been carefully arranged, each item marked and recorded, as though Kate had been less a grieving widow and more a meticulous archivist of death. Most chilling of all was her journal. Its pages carried the slow descent of her mind from mourning to rationalizing to sanctifying violence itself. She had come to believe that mass murder was not merely her right, but her holy calling. The final entries, written only days before her last hunt, outlined ambitious plans to widen her territory and even to recruit others to carry on what she believed was God's work. For 3 long days, Freeman's team sifted through evidence, documenting everything in painstaking detail. With the journal as their map, they searched the forests and fields of Virginia, uncovering graves long hidden. In the end, the tally of lives taken reached 47. The youngest was just 8 years old. The oldest, 63. Entire families had vanished beneath her hands, and all of it staged with the same cold precision, the same twisted sense of divine theater. Her story spread quickly through the secret channels of the Underground Railroad. Freeman's report warned abolitionists and escapees alike, teaching them how predators might hunt and how to guard against the tactics of those who fed on fear. Yet the report did more than instruct. It proved something almost no one dared believe, that even a terror who seemed supernatural, who had become myth in her own lifetime, could be brought down by disciplined strategy and courage. Still, the image of Kate refusing to die, rising again and again, despite mortal wounds, lingered like a nightmare. Some wondered if she had been human at all. Others said that question no longer mattered, her body had fallen. Her reign was ended. The woman who strangled 47 souls now lay in silence, her hands still at last in the dirt of Virginia. There would be no marked grave for her. Freeman's men buried her deep in the woods she had haunted, leaving no monument, no trace, only whispers. The plantation was abandoned, its walls crumbling vines creeping over blackened beams. Locals would pass the place with nervous glances, murmuring that it was cursed, though few knew the scale of the horrors that had once been plotted within. Within a decade, the forest reclaimed it all as though eager to erase her from the world. Official records told another story, vague and evasive. Some claimed the mysterious killer had simply vanished. Others suggested she might have died of illness far away. The truth that she had been stopped was known only to a secret handful of men and women who understood that some truths were too dangerous to put into public record. But fear has its own half-life. Even long after Kate's death, the Underground Railroad routes through central Virginia lay broken. Escapees whispered of a forest demon who still stalked the trees. And though the woman herself was gone, her legend kept whole families from risking the journey north. The shadow of her violence proved far harder to bury than her body. And so the story ends, yet perhaps not truly. What lingers is not her life, nor her death, but the question she leaves behind. Could such methodical evil have really existed in the heart of early America? Or is the terror of Henrico County a mirror reflecting the darker corners of our own human nature? Kate Bender was not born a monster. She was shaped by grief, by a system built on cruelty, and by a society that looked away when violence served its purpose. She reminds us that evil seldom looks monstrous at first glance. It often hides behind respectability, smiles at its neighbors' praise in church pews, and plans unspeakable acts in the dark. Perhaps the most disturbing truth of all is this: Once we stop seeing others as fully human, there are no limits to the cruelty we can justify. Her story whispers across the years that the line between humanity and monstrosity lies not in fate but in choice. So tell me, do you believe all of Kate Bender's secrets were uncovered that September morning? Or might darker truths still lie buried beneath Virginia soil waiting to be unearthed?